Good evening, everyone. So, if you've been here the last several times that I've spoken, hopefully you remember that we're doing a little bit of a series in the book of Colossians. If you want to go ahead and start turning there, we will get there here in just a few moments. Colossians chapter 3. So the world is filled with all sorts of conflict and turmoil, isn't it? I mean, there's nations that rise up against nations. There's social classes that have disagreements. There's coworkers that have problems getting along in their job. There's employers and employees that often are at odds. There's husbands and wives who live together under a roof, but sometimes the house looks more like a battlefield. There's children that clash with their parents over generational differences. And in general, in society, people have a problem interacting. A problem interacting peaceably with one another. There's conflict seems to be prevalent in today's society, and to some extent even expected. But as you think about it, this really shouldn't be too much of a surprise that the world is the way it is. Since the fall of man, things like angerness and bitterness and hatred have entered the world. And it started out by just going into one family unit, into the family of Adam and Eve and their kids, and Cain kills Abel. But then it spills over into a society. And this is all due to the fallen nature of man. Now, some people, they're more peaceable than others. And some people are just better at pretending than others. But nonetheless, I'm sure that everybody in here tonight, at one point in their life, has encountered conflict. And conflict can be detrimental to a society. And it can be detrimental to homes. And as believers, we're commanded to live different lives, aren't we? We're supposed to be new people that go into our homes and make new homes. And as homes spill over into the communities around them, changing those, and into society and into the world, making a new world. A.T. Robinson put it this way: real Christianity is both doctrine and a life. Mere belief is dead without life as a proof. Real spiritual life is impossible without a vital contact with God. In our dealings with others become the final proof of our connection with Christ. And our dealings with others become our final proof of our real connection with Christ. So he's saying that Christianity is dead in our lives if it's not impacting other people. And that is what we're going to look at tonight. That's what Paul is going to talk about in the scriptures that we're covering tonight. He's going to talk about how Christ's likeness should be portrayed in our lives, both in our home lives as well as our lives out in public. We encounter other people every day, and so we must learn to interact with them in a way that is pleasing to the Lord. And so the text that we're going to look at tonight contains three sets of appeals. The first appeal is going to be to husbands and wives and how they should interact. The second appeal that Paul is going to give is to children and parents and how they should interact. And the third appeal that we'll look at tonight is how servants and masters and how they should interact. And so tonight, as we look at these three sets and see how God has called us to live a life that is radically different than that of the world. So let's start out by looking at Colossians chapter 3 and verses 18 and 19. It says, "Wives, submit to yourselves to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them." So before we really jump into this tonight, I think it's important to talk about who Paul is writing to in this letter. Paul is writing to the church in Colossae. And he's writing to the people that attend that church, some of which would be husbands and wives. Husbands, Christian husbands and Christian wives. And these Christian husbands and Christian wives live in homes that are Christian homes, or at least homes that are striving to be Christian homes. So Paul is talking about what relationships between Christian husbands and Christian wives should look like in a home that's striving to be Christian. He's not necessarily talking about men's and women's roles in society, or men's and women's roles in the marketplace, or men's and women's roles in politics. There's other scriptures that we could look at that would probably deal more specifically with those. But tonight, he's talking about Christian husbands and Christian wives in a Christian home, striving to live in a Christian home, striving to live into the fullness of what God has intended in their homes. So it says, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. These scriptures would have been radical in the ancient world. William Barclay points out that under Jewish law, a woman was nothing more than a thing. She was a possession to her husband, no different than her home, her flock, or any other material goods that he owned. She had no legal rights whatsoever. For instance, under Jewish law, the husband could divorce his wife for practically anything, even burning dinner. But the wives had no legal rights to initiate divorce at all. And it wasn't just in the Jewish culture either. Barclay goes on to point out that in Greek society, respectable women, as they put it, lived their entire lives in seclusion. She never appeared out in the streets alone or without being accompanied by her husband, not even in the marketplace to shop. She lived in the women's apartment and didn't even join the menfolk for meals. And from this, he goes on to point out that all the duties were to the wife, and all the rights were for the men. All the duty was to the wife, and all the privilege belonged to the husband. And so this appeal that Paul was giving to the Colossians church was vastly different than that of the Colossian culture. And wives here were addressed equally as much as the husbands. And so this would be something radically different to them. Also for the husbands, they were giving duties as well as the wives. It wasn't all the duty being on the wife. And it is they're admonished both in the name of the Lord. And based on the context, he's calling us to live lives that are totally and completely regulated in Christ. And so this brought both dignity to men and to women. And they were both under the lordship, both in equality. And so it would have been incredibly elevating to women of that culture and that status. And yet at the same time, these words carry a certain hierarchy to them. F.F. Bruce puts it this way. Paul holds that there is a divine instituted hierarchy in creation. In the order that the place of the wife comes next after the husband. So Bruce, he's pointing out that God first created man and then he created woman. And he puts forth an idea that this creates some sort of hierarchy in there between the man and the wife. But he goes on to say that it's not one of superiority. It's just a hierarchy. In fact, it's interesting to look at the Greek word there that says that the wife should submit to her husband. You see that word, the Greek word there for submit, it appears one other place in the New Testament that's interesting to take a look at. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 28, it's talking about Jesus, and it says that the Son is subject to the Father. Talking about Jesus, it's saying that Jesus is subject or submissive to the Father. So the type of submission that Paul is talking about here in Colossians is the same type of submission that we see in the Trinity as a model. It's one where, on one hand, Jesus is submissive to the Father, and yet on the other hand, he is equal to the Father, both at the exact same time. It's both simultaneously submissive and yet equal. So Paul is saying that the same thing about the husbands and the wives, that they should be both simultaneously submissive and yet equal with their husbands. And saying that the two should coexist in a Christian relationship, in a Christian marriage. And in today's culture, it might be easy for us to look at this verse and just say, oh, it's an old-fashioned verse. It's an old-fashioned way of thinking. Just try to excuse it away excuse it away. But it's in God's word, and so we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss what it has to say. Before we move on, it's important to note what this word submit doesn't mean. You see, if you look at how you can translate the words that's used, the Greek word there that's used for submit, there's no way that you can translate it to mean anything close to servitude or bondage or slavery or anything like that. In fact, it has a different implication. It has an implication of being voluntary. And so the wife has to be free to voluntarily choose to submit to her husband. And it's worth stating again that this appeal, it's not for everybody. It's for Christian wives and Christian husbands who want to live in Christian homes. So we talked a lot about the wife side of things. What about the husband? It says, husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. For men, this would have been just as equally radical in the time period which it was given. Edward Louse did an extensive study of extra-biblical text around this time period that looked into different household roles of what normal roles, if you will, for husbands and wives. And he said that in none of it could he find any idea, any notion that the husband was supposed to love his wife. It was a novel idea to their culture. It was a novel command to their culture, and the husbands were commanded to love their wives. And as we look at the Greek word there for love, you might know that there's many different Greek words that get translated into love in the English language. And so we might be tempted to think that it says that the husband should eros their wives, or they should love them with a erotic love. That's not what it says. We might be tempted to think that it says there that the husband should phileo their wives or love them with a deep love of friendship. But that's not what it says either. It says that the husband should agape their wives. This is the same type of love that's used to describe the love of God's immeasurable, incomparable love for mankind. Agape love, it's unconditional, it's sacrificial, it's pure, it's unceasing. And Paul is saying that this is the type of love that a man should have for his wife. There's a parallel verse to this in Ephesians chapter 5 where it's talking about the same topic, but Paul adds a little bit that I think supports this. It says that husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. And so he commands husbands to love their wives with a radical love like that of Christ loving the church enough to die for it. And so Paul starts out with two radical commands here. One, that the wives should submit to their husbands, and the husbands should love their wives as Christ loves the church. And Paul says that this pattern can lead to fullness in Christian marriage, fullness in love, fullness in commitment, fullness in blessing. But Paul doesn't stop there. He talks about another area. He talks about another area that we should consider in light of the gospel in our relationships. It goes on in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 20 to say that children should obey their parents in what? In everything. For this pleases the Lord. And fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. So the first thing that we should realize is that in order to have Christ's fullness in our home, that there must be a sense of discipline in the house. You see, if the kids are allowed to run around willy-nilly, there's no rules, then how are they supposed to obey this command to obey their parents? Put another way, what are they to obey if there's nothing to obey? So I think Paul is saying that there has to be, that discipline is a key to a child-parent's fullness, relationship fullness. And it's interesting to point out that psychologists today have begun finding evidence that this is true. There's one by the name of Dr. Stanley Cooper Smith. He's an associate professor of psychology at the University of California. And he surveyed 1,738 normal middle-class boys and their families when they were in their pre-adolescence. And he followed them all the way up to manhood. And once they were adults, he interviewed them. He categorized them into two groups, ones with high self-esteem and ones with low self-esteem. And what he found was pretty interesting. He found that first, that the ones with high self-esteem came from homes where they were clearly more loved and appreciated as they were growing up. Second, he found that the ones with high self-esteem came from homes where their parents were significantly more strict in their approach to discipline. And third, he found that the homes with the high self-esteem kids in it were ones that were characterized by democracy and openness. And so discipline and obedience, they're indispensable if we want to experience the fullness that God wants us to have in our homes. And the command there, it says that the kids should obey their parents. This is considerably different than the verse that we talked about for the wife, where she should submit to her husband. It's a voluntary submission, a choice. But here it's saying that the kids must obey. It's more of a command. It's more of an absolute. And the word obey here is an interesting word in the Greek because it carries two connotations. On one hand, it carries the connotation of hearing, so that the kids should hear their parents. But on the other hand, it carries a connotation of action, that they should not just hear, but they should listen. They should not just hear, but they should be motivated to action. They should act on what they hear. So they shouldn't just listen to their parents, but they should also do what they're told to do and follow the instructions that they are given. And in a culture today where you can be at the store, or you can be at a restaurant, and you can hear terms like, "Are you listening to me? Did you hear what I said? Are you even listening to the words that I'm saying?" It's just as radical in today's culture as it was back in Paul's time. And obedience begins with hearing, but not just hearing, but also listening. And it says that the children should obey their parents in what? It says everything, right? It doesn't say that you should only obey them whenever it's convenient. It doesn't say that you should obey them only when it gets you what you want. But it says in everything, every time. And why? Because it pleases the Lord. Paul expands on this a little more in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 1 through 3, where it says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, as for it is right. Honor your mother and father, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and you may enjoy a long life on earth." And so if you're a child, and if you're a Christian, and you're striving to live as a Christian, this one's for you. You should obey your parents in everything because it pleases the Lord. And it will bring fullness to your relationship with your parents. And if you don't, if you neglect this, at some point, it will come back to haunt you. At some point, it'll come back to give you great sorrow. It may not be tomorrow, it may not be a month, it may be years from now before it does. But sooner or later, that the attitude will catch up with you. But parents, there's something here for you too, right? It says in verse 21, "Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged." Do you know that there's two major ways that you can train a horse, that you can break a horse? It comes with many different names, but the first category of them is usually referred to something like mutual bonding. It's about building relationship with the horse. It's about progressively gaining the trust of the horse. And as you build relationship, as you build trust with the horse, eventually it lets you put a halter on it. You build some more relationship, you build some more trust. It lets you put a bit in his mouth. You build some more relationship, some more trust. Eventually you can put a blanket on it. And eventually saddle. And before long, you'll be able to ride the horse. And if it's done correctly, it can produce a full-spirited horse that's very obedient. The other category goes by many names, but it's a category that's done by dominance. It's done by fear. It's done by pain and suffering. And a horse, it can be tamed this way, but it comes at a great cost. You see, the horse will be a spiritless animal. It'll have no spirit. Yes, it'll be obedient, but it'll never be what it could have been. And I think the same thing can be true with parents and their relationships to their children. I think that's what Paul is warning about here, that if you take the wrong approach, if you're not careful, your children can get discouraged. They can lose heart. They can withdraw. They can bottle it up inside until they break or until they rebel. And so Paul's advice here is not to fall into that trap. And while the advice here is primarily to fathers, I think it can apply to either parents. And the Greek word there, it says that for embittered, it can be translated a whole bunch of ways. It has a great many ways that it can be translated, as it means a great many things, many connotations. It can mean things like to rouse to anger, to irritate, to provoke, to stir up, to make resentful. And so, yes, Paul says that we should discipline our children because the children have to obey, but we should also encourage them. We should also build them up. It shouldn't just be discipline. We should build them up with nurturing them in love and praise, and also being consistent. Because there's nothing more irritating to a horse than a rider who kicks it in the side saying, let's go, and at the same time pulls back on the reins saying, whoa, hold on a minute. And the same thing can be true with kids. So parents should have a united front, and kids should be given clear direction. Because consistency is key. If you want to have fullness in your family relationships, yes, you must discipline your children, but you should also build them up and encourage them at the same time, and spend time with them and nurture them in love. So we looked at relationships between husbands and wives. We talked a little bit about relationships between parents and children. And lastly, Paul talks about another set. It talks about the relationship between masters and slaves. Let's take a look, starting in verse 22. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eyes are on you and to curry favor, but with sincere hearts and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as if working for the Lord, not only for human masters. Since you know that you have received your inheritance from the Lord as your reward. It is the Lord Christ that you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for what they do wrong, and there is no favoritism. Masters, provide for your slaves what is right and what is fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. So Paul goes on to talk about the fullness between masters and their slaves. Paul's teaching here would have been just as radical in the time period that it was written as it would have been for the husbands and what he said to the husbands, the wives, the children, and the parents. This perhaps might have been even more radical. Ancient historians estimate the population of the Roman Empire to be roughly 60 million people. And of that, they estimate that 40% of that population were slaves. Roughly 24 out of 60 million people in the Roman Empire were slaves. That's almost half. Think about that. Because of this, work was considered below the dignity of all the free owners. Practically everything was done by slaves, from doctoring to teaching to cleaning. And most slaves had rough living conditions. A Roman writer once wrote to a friend of his that bought a farm, and he told them they should toss out the old slaves to die because they were nothing more than broken tools. Gaius, which was a Roman lawyer at this time period, he wrote this: "We may note that it is universally accepted that the master's possessions, that the master possesses the power of life and death over their slaves." The situation for slaves in general was not good. And for some, it was downright terrible. But when Christianity came on the scene, it started preaching this idea of equality, and it started to rise tensions between their masters and slaves. And so Paul's advice here would eventually be revolutionary and bring the end to slavery, ultimately, the message of Christianity. And we might be willing to look at this and be like, okay, that's great, but what does it have to do with us today? I mean, we're not really masters, we're not really slaves, so what does it have to do with us today? Well, Paul started out talking about relationships between husbands and wives and parents and children, relationships that happen and exist within a home, right? And then he moves on to talk about relationships between slaves and masters. And these slaves and masters are working all day long outside of the home, out in society. And if you think about it, our daily lives are broken up the same way. We spend a portion of our time in our homes with our families, and we spend a portion of our lives out in society in careers and jobs, and hopefully they don't look like slavery, but, maybe. And so I think the same truths hold true to us today as we look at our relationships out in the marketplace, out in our jobs. So in order for Christ to bring fullness to our lives, he must bring it into where we are living. He must bring it also into society, out to where we are working, whether masters or slaves or whether employees or employers. So let's look back at verses 22 and 23. It says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not because their eyes are on you and to curry favor, but with sincere hearts and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do it with all your heart, as if working for the Lord, not for human masters." Hearing these words without explanation, we might be tempted to be like, oh, whoa, hold on, Paul. Whose side are you on anyway? But think about how these words must have sounded to a slave. It says slaves must obey their masters in everything. And slaves were often asked to do very unpleasant things. And so this would have been a tough command for them to follow, especially when it's followed up with not only when their master's eyes are on you or you're trying to win favor. The Greek word there literally translates eye service. Work that's only done when your boss is watching. But we all know what this looks like, right? The boss gives you an assignment, and he goes back to his office to work, and you pull out your phone, your boss walks around the corner, catches you on your phone instead of working. Or you leave early, but because of the eye service, you only do half the job. Or you're told to sweep the room, and you sweep all the dirt under the carpet. It's about not doing what you're supposed to do. But instead, Paul says that we should do it with sincerity of heart. We should do it with all of our hearts. Notice here that it doesn't come with any qualifications. It doesn't say, well, do it with all your heart if it's pleasant. No, it says nothing. It doesn't qualify it. Whether it's pleasant or whether it's unpleasant, we should do it with all of our hearts. Whether it's dull or whether it's challenging, whether it's menial or whether it's interesting, we should do it with all of our hearts. It simply states that everything must be done energetically, with all of our hearts, whether our boss is watching or not. For some jobs, if these verses stood alone, this might be nearly impossible to follow. But it's followed by something else, isn't it? Let's take a look. It says that in verse 23, whatever you do, work at it with all of your heart, as if working for the Lord, not for human masters. So the pagan slaves, they would obey their masters because they were bound by fear. A fear that if they didn't obey them, that they could be taken out in the street and killed. But Christian slaves, they knew that they served a different master. And so they would serve for different reasons. Because they served the true master. They served God with all of their hearts. And in verses 24 and 25, it goes on to say that this work ethic comes with a reward. It says, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as your reward. And to the first century Christians, this would have been largely great news, because under Roman law, slaves did not have any inheritance whatsoever. And yet here, Paul says that they do have an inheritance. It may not be one on this earth, but it's if they work faithfully, they will receive their reward in heaven. And this ought to bring some encouragement to us, whatever your lot in life is. Whether you're working alongside someone and they're getting paid more than you and doing half the work, well, don't worry. Your reward is also in heaven. And it should be noted here that Paul isn't teaching us to overwork or to be a workaholic. He's simply teaching that we should fulfill our commitments. We should fulfill our job duties, whether our boss is watching or not, and do it with the best attitude and with dependability and the best integrity. And so that's what it also has a word for masters or employers or managers or supervisors, right? In verse 1, it says, "Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven." Remember that under Roman law, that slaves had no rights whatsoever. And so these words would have had a strange ring to the Christian master, or the newly Christian master, because the society taught something completely different. And so this command would have been difficult for them to carry out. They would have had to carry it out with fear of being ostracized by their fellow slave owners. But the guiding principle that Paul is going about here is that whether you're the master, whether you're the slave, you really have the same master. And so it's less about a master-slave relationship. It's more about both of their relationships with God. So if you're an employer, you're a manager, you're a supervisor, think about how you treat your employers or your employees. You see, I think if we truly understand this, what Paul is trying to say here, we might treat our employees differently. We might make sure that they're paid what they're supposed to be paid. We might make sure that they're paid on time. We might make sure that when they call in sick, that we're not saying, "Oh man, you're calling in sick again, you're leaving me short-handed." But instead, be worried about them. Be concerned about their life and their welfare. Not just their welfare, but what about their spouses, their children? What about their education? What about their chances for advancement in the company? I think a lot of this would change if we truly understand the relationship with God as the master, the true master. And if we do this, I think we'll have more fulfilled employees and a better, more fulfilled relationship with employees and employers. The worship team wants to go ahead and come back and wrap up real quick. So Paul talks about husbands and wives. He talks about parents and children, masters and slaves, employers and employees. And one thing's for sure, Jesus is the fullness of the universe. And he wants us to have the fullness in our relationships with others, whether it be marital relationships with family members, whether it be in our professional relationships. Moreover, he desires that this fullness overflow out into the world, out to where we do business, and have an effect on them, and bring fullness to those around us. And so tonight, as we close, we've taken a look at how Paul says that we should have fullness as a husband, as a wife, as a member of a household, as a member of society. And so if you're a Christian and you're wanting to live your life as a Christian, and you're a husband or a wife, consider what Paul says, that you should submit and you should love. And if you're a Christian and you're wanting to live as a Christian, you're a parent or a child, consider what Paul has to say about obeying and not embittering. And if you're a Christian and you're wanting to live as a Christian and you're an employer, an employee, consider what Paul is saying about your relationships, how you treat others, and your work relationships. Because Paul is calling us to live not ordinary lives, not lives like the rest of the world, but lives that are in the fullness of Christ. And I don't know about you, but that's the type of life I want to live. So we're a little bit over tonight, but I want to spend a couple minutes in prayer at least. Would you take time tonight and pray and ask God what he would have you to do in your relationships, and ask him what he would have you do to bring fullness to your relationships, whether with your family or society. And when he tells you that, make a commitment to make a change this week in that area. So let's spend at least a couple minutes in prayer, and then Pastor CJ will come back and close us out.